Welcome to Superhero Spectating with Harold and Hassan. We're a fan based podcast with two non experts exploring superheroes. As always, we're happy to have you along for some theories and fun. Welcome to the episode. Heroes, Harold and Hassan. Heroes, Harold and Hassan. Heroes, Harold and Hassan. Heroes, Harold and Hassan. Hey listeners, we're back for another episode of Superhero Spectating with Heroes Harold and Heroes Hassan and our special guest. Say hi, special guest.
Hello.
That's Tim. Back for another episode. We're happy to have him. And today we're talking about Moon Knight. So, Marvel's Encyclopedia, updated, regards Moon Knight as a mercenary left for dead in the Egyptian desert. Mark Spector was found by followers of the Egyptian god Khonshu, who saved his life and gave him superhuman powers. Returning to the US with the statue of Khonshu, Mark became a crime fighter, calling himself the Moon Knight and assuming two more alter egos, millionaire Stephen Grant and taxi driver Jake Lockley. You also, in the description, see a few mentions to characters who were teased in episode 1, i.e. Frenchie, and they haven't spoken too much about his lover Marlene, nor Werewolf, which was the villain that he was debuted fighting. And there's a QR code in the museum that he works in episode 1 that actually, if you scan it, directs you to a copy of that comic book. But Tim, you being the one that's read the most Moon Knight comic books, how excited were you to see him on screen, and what were your thoughts of episode 1?
I was really excited. I always thought he was a very intriguing character. The comics that I read were in earlier days and the mental aspect character and more on the superhero, you know what I mean? And one of the things that makes Moon Knight unique is because of his obscurity, pretty much every single run of Knight from now back to decades ago, every single run is something very different because his audience was so small. Every team of writers that was acting a different character have more creative freedom than most comic authors can. Like everybody knows, Batman is meant to be a certain way. Everybody knows Spider-Man is meant to be a certain way, or Superman, or the Avengers. But with Moon Knight, the authors could sort of experiment and get a little crazy. And because he has an aspect of unpredictability to his character, yeah, the writers could really get creative. And I was pleased with the direction that this show has been going. They've been focusing on the mental aspect of the character, of his dissociative identity disorder.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that will be a large, it seems like that will definitely be in the forefront of the series. And I think it'll be very interesting to explore that because it's a fascinating part of Moon Knight's character that he has essentially 3 different people sharing one body. And he has to juggle that along with being a superhero, along with supposedly being resurrected from the dead and having a connection to a mystical entity that some comics leave it very ambiguous as to whether this god Khonshu is actually real or whether it's just another manifestation of Mark's illness.
I think they do a good job
never really
showing that in the show as well.
Yeah, it's never really explicitly stated if Khonshu is a real mystical force or if it's in his head. So I'm excited to see where the show goes after episode 1. I think Oscar Isaac was a fantastic choice, and he just in episode 1, really showed how perfect he was for the role because of how different he can portray Stephen Grant and Mark Spector, and just the variety of emotion that he can bring to the character.
And as a spectator, since you are on superhero spectating, if you could write the character yourself for the rest of his arc, how would you like for him to be used, or what do you think the team of writers could do to do justice to the character?
I think that the primary conflict for that particular character should remain mostly internal. He has the internal conflict of his different personalities sort of clashing with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe at first they don't really like sharing a body with one another. They're always bickering or fighting for control. And then I think a good arc for him is learning to accept his illness and learning to learning to live with the worst parts of himself, because Mark Spector in particular is a deeply disturbed person. He's pretty sick in a lot of the comics, and he can do some very deranged things on his worst days. But he can also do some very heroic and positive things on his best days, and that's sort of the interesting dichotomy of Moon Knight. I think that he can be legitimately heroic, or he can be legitimately like Moon Knight actually can be on his worst, on his worst moments. So I think a good arc for him, which it seems like the writers are sort of going in that direction, is keeping a focus on that internal struggle of trying to be better and trying to do the right thing despite struggling with some pretty heavy mental illnesses.
Got it. We're going to talk a bit more about his several identities and our takes on the show. But we want to make sure that we are being fair to mental health care professionals and saying that we aren't. We're not therapists, we're not psychiatrists, we're not psychologists, and we don't want any of the commentary that we're using in this episode to be considered advice that should be used in any context other than a character study. This is fun and interesting, and we're just sharing our perspectives. However poorly informed they may be in comparison to one who studies mental health disorders like DID. But let's get into what we think about Moon Knight so far. So there's a modality that I came across working with some therapists, and it's called internal family systems. And I believe that it is used to treat individuals that suffer with dissociative identity disorder, previously known as multiple personality disorder. And the idea is that there are personalities that have idiosyncratic perspectives and ranges of emotions, and we're actually all multiples within our mind. And that there can be distress and dysfunction that can be remedied by family systems counseling. Those personalities represent individual parts within us that are extra fractured and disjointed because of post traumatic stress, which is something that Stephen and Mark and even Jake, who it seems like we're seeing a bit of now, all seem to have in common, as well as Khonshu. And I want to get into an idea of some of the parts and then explain how I think they relate to the characters that we're seeing in this episode. And one of those parts is self. Self is it's this concept representing what's left over when any of the other parts are not having a conversation. And there are 8 core characteristics. There's calmness, clarity, curiosity, compassion, confidence, courage, creativity, and connectedness. And again, self only emerges when all other parts relinquish control, which is something that we're starting to see in the dynamic between characters like Mark and Steven in episode 3 or the mid season episode, but we'll come back to that. And I want to highlight as we're learning more, talking about it more, that dysfunction in families or these family systems can be a conflict of each partner's good intentions. And all parts are good and important and deserve to be deeply understood. The way that parts interact is the problem, because we've seen characters like Stephen and Mark be reluctant to open up a space for another personality or part of them to be heard. Could be an 8-year old version of themselves struggling with trauma, could be Mark Spector, who seemingly died in the desert and was resurrected by Khonshu, could be Jake, who feels like he hasn't yet been heard and is trying to literally fight his way out into the outside world so that he can finally be free. Free from Khonshu, I don't know. Free from the overshadowing voices of Steven and Mark, yet to be discovered. And I'm sure we'll find out in episode 4. But the other parts in the burden internal system that people like to bring attention to are managers, firefighters, and exiles. And managers are these primary parts that act to keep a person feeling secure by controlling them, events, and other parts. And they bear huge burdens of responsibility for keeping life together and fear that relinquishing control will tend to lead to worse outcomes. I personally think that the manager that we've seen represent those qualities is Khonshu, and common manager behaviors and traits include being controlling, analyzing, criticizing, things that we've seen Arthur combat in Khonshu in all the episodes leading up to this one. And again, we'll come back to Arthur. Being judging, caretaking, which Khonshu has done by giving his avatar's healing abilities and the ability to be able to like serve serve him, unfortunately, by manipulating them, but still providing them the means necessary to achieve his goal or the goals that they have that are in conjunction with his. But they're also pessimistic, numbing, and over planning. And then there's firefighters, and firefighters spring into action whenever there's pain from other parts, especially the more wounded exiles. And they're powerful and automatically repress emerging exiles. And I'll talk about exiles in a moment. But I think that the firefighter that we've seen up until episode 3 was Mark, because he was quick to tell Steven, hey, I'm here, I can protect you, I can save you. And the sooner you who is in distress gives me control, the sooner we can transition out of this emotional turmoil. And then some common firefighter behaviors and traits are abusing substances, attempting suicide, binging on food, having affairs, dissociating, cutting, and distracting. And exiles are parts that have been rejected or traumatized and hold deep wounds and memories filled with terror, pain, and shame. I think that Stephen was introduced to us as the exile in the group, but I think that the more we saw about Mark's relationship with Layla and the parts of himself that he wasn't unaware of or struggling to share himself with or share more about or of, the more he became an exile. And the moment he became an exile is when there was room for a new firefighter to emerge, which would probably be Jake Lockley, which is the most aggressive of the bunch. And common exile behaviors and traits are sensitivity, anger, dependency, innocence, spontaneity, and openness. Things that we've kind of seen in Steven when he's wearing the suit that represents Mr. Knight and other parts. And I think that they, now that Khonshu's gone, will be able to have a coherent conversation with the other parts of themselves, because we've seen Steven and Mark shift back and forth a little reluctantly, but what was it, 2 or 3 times in the last episode? And they consensually shifted and shared their bodies with one another, and they're having a conversation, and there's more trust in the other. So I think once they get Jake in there, they figure out what he's upset about, they give him a space to speak. I think the moment that the three of them, amongst their 5 identities, if you include Mr. Knight and Moon Knight, like once they all are having a coherent conversation, I think Self will emerge, and then we'll see some moments that we've seen in the comics. And I'm just really interested in seeing how much more of his mental health they can explore, and how Disney is going to take a safe approach to introducing it to folks, because I feel like they've stressed how hard it is for someone to be in a relationship with a mental health disorder. But I also love that Layla has seemingly presented herself in someone that's in love with all of the parts of Mark, which is a very beautiful thing. And the moment that they're in self, which is the deepest essence or center of the person, I think they'll feel a little less fractured, because Mark will finally know all the dimensions of himself. He'll know that his partner loves him for who he is, and I think he'll finally have peace, because there's this calm, compassionate, courageous, confident, curious, calm, and clear minded individual that's finally able to emerge from all of the stress, distress, and trauma that they've been enduring over the course of their livelihood. And I know that was a lot. I've been talking for like 10 minutes. What are your thoughts, guys?
Well, did you want to share any thoughts first, Harold?
Okay, you go for it.
All right. Well, that's a lot of interesting information you had to share there, Hassan. I hadn't considered a lot of that. I think I'm definitely interested to see where the show goes next. I feel like the first episode had the most emphasis on the mental aspect of Steven's character and Mark's character, and I I think episode 2 and 3 has been leaning more into the Marvel superhero side of the show. Um, and I'm hoping that in the last few we'll get a little more leaning back in the other direction, because I think that's the most interesting aspect of the character, and I think that's something that will really make him stand out. So if done well, I think it could be a really cool thing to see a character like that, reaching a larger audience in an MCU property.
Harold and I were just talking about how the character study seems to be the best part of the show so far, because for me, I was a little underwhelmed by the use of the gods in the last episode. I felt like the gods are always depicted as these angry, uncivil, unbending entities, and the fury and the scale of them in this last episode seemed so unrealistic to me. I thought it was a great way to introduce how present they are, but in my mind, I was thinking, oh, now you're recreating the same problem that we had with the Eternals. It's like you've been present here for eons, and
Mm-hmm.
you've just decided to observe when there are all these Avengers level threats approaching humanity. If you were really interested in seeing humanity do the best for themselves, I don't know. That
The
part
other
was a reach.
the other strange thing is how in episode 3 we see two examples of sort of cosmic events that would definitely be noticed by people outside the circle that know. Yeah, first we saw Khonshu create an eclipse, and then we saw him turn back the sky in episode 3.
Wouldn't that have been him turning
And
back time as well?
yeah, I guess so, or at least a part turning back time, maybe in a small bubble of space or something. I don't really know, but I find it very convenient that we go dozens and dozens of movies and shows in the MCU without anything happening that would be related to the Egyptian gods, and then the very episode they're introduced to us, all this crazy stuff happens that would be noticed by the entire world. And like you said, it just seems like the scene to me in the pyramid where all the gods were meeting and talking through their avatars felt like it could have been right out of the Eternals.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I found a little disappointing about the episodes 2 and 3 of Moon Knight is parts of it felt like things that we've seen before.
Yeah, even
And
Percy Jackson did it better.
yeah, and from the trailers, of Moon Knight, it seemed like it was going to be something really different, very psychological and kind of surreal, and maybe with an unreliable narrator, and it would make the viewer question things and maybe wonder if the main character is, if all this stuff is in his head or if it's actually real. And with the direction they've gone, there's kind of no question that all of this is very real. It's not really left ambiguous at all.
Hmm.
And so I found that a little disappointing.
Yeah, I want to add to you guys' thoughts because Hassan and I did have a previous conversation on the episodes, and I also enjoyed the character study and even the mystery. I actually got a chance to rewatch the first two episodes before watching the third. And I remember the first time watching it, I told Hassan that, especially after the first episode, I had mentioned to him I had a bit of Oscar Isaac fatigue. Like I was fatigued from seeing his face everywhere. So he didn't sell me in the first episode. It felt like I was just watching Oscar Isaac act as it felt like I was watching him act. But having rewatched the episodes and understanding Moon Knight more, he sold me on Steven and Mark as identities, and personalities, and it's that part of the show that attracts me to the show itself, because so far some of the scenes with the gods and the avatars has pulled me out of the experience a little bit. And it's probably to the points that you guys have brought up, how it could be things we have seen, which I was actually telling Hassan that it reminded me, I believe, of season 6 of The Flash, I want to say, where they brought in
the still
Speed
force
gods,
and the strange
and
force and
it
avatars.
got really cheesy and just pulled us out of the experience. I pretty much fell off watching Flash around that time. But yeah, I was enjoying the stuff with Steven. And to take it back to the first episode, I was watching it with my girlfriend, and at the end of the episode, she was still confused on the dream part. She was just like, so was Steven dreaming? And I was just like, no, Mark had tricked Steven into thinking everything was a dream, but things were actually happening. Like, Steven at some point thought that the whole chase scene was a dream, and pretty much we as an audience were Steven. And yeah,
I hadn't thought about
enjoyed
that.
those parts.
Yeah, I guess Steven kind of got gaslit, didn't he?
yes, he did. Oh, that's so sad.
Mark went to go buy the goldfish, and you don't see these parts, but Mark had to put Steven back in bed the way exactly Steven went into bed for Steven to think that everything was a dream.
Yeah,
and it even confused, like, us as an audience. I was just like, oh, that was I didn't even see that the first time, you know. So it was something I was able to appreciate watching it again.
Yeah, I kind of wish that the show was a bit more about that kind of thing. I feel like episode 2 gave us a lot of answers very quickly and sort of took away a lot of the mystery.
Yeah,
I think
episode 3 had a lot of exposition.
I liked it. I liked the exposition. I think the problem is something similar to what happened with the Scarlet Witch in WandaVision. I think this new phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is exploring a lot of the side characters or tier 2 heroes that they introduced in the Infinity Saga and finally giving them more fleshed out stories. But part of the problem is we're seeing their fleshed out stories still needing to bleed in, and there's not too big a problem with this, but their fleshed out story is needing to bleed into the development of the rest of the saga. Like, we're clearly, spoilers, going to see Kang from Loki again. We obviously are getting Wanda, and Wanda's not going to get a season 2, but Wanda's got a few movie deals in development. I think she's definitely getting one, but she's got, what, 7 more years and maybe a trilogy coming up. And Falcon, I can't remember if he's going to get a season 2 after the movie, but Falcon and the Winter Soldier are leading into Captain America 4. It's not just about telling a good story or telling the story that we didn't get from them. It's about telling more. And I think that the campy or cheesy parts of season 1 are kind of a conflict that's produced by that issue, because Eternals spoke to things that were happening centuries ago. We saw 5 years pass in Endgame, and then we saw a handful of things that were happening afterwards, and people make references to what happened during the blip or those gaps. And you could have told a solid story opportunity and say, hey, this is all of the things that happened in between. And Harold and I have had a lot of conversations about that. He actually wrote his own What If series before What If came out, trying to do a better job than Marvel of connecting the dots. And I feel like it would just be character study, and we'd see more Steven if they didn't have to say this is how Steven, Mark, and Jake are going to blend into what we might see in the rest of the universe. And he might be getting a season 2. We may see more characters. We may see Frenchie, Layla. We might see Marlene and his daughter. There's a lot they can do. And maybe then they'll give him more him time or them time. But to the point you made, I think they're trying to set up a lot of moving pieces, and it may be taking away from the story. Because Khonshu did have to disappear, and there have been parts of Moon Knight's story where he gave up being Moon Knight, or he chose to be Moon Knight without Khonshu. So in some ways, they're just taking a creative approach to that, right? But I don't know. I'd be excited to just see a dark Moon Knight Did I say Moon Knight? Yeah, a dark Moon Knight, Midnight Sun story where we're seeing him beat up Werewolf and we're seeing him fight some of his own villains. But it hasn't been that, but I still think it's been great. What are your overall thoughts on the show so far, y'all?
I'm interested to see where it goes. I've enjoyed parts of it greatly, and other parts I thought were sort of just things that we've seen before. And yeah, I have high hopes for what it could be.
As for me, like, I don't know much about Moon Knight, so watching it is just an experience in itself, just learning about the character. Well, at least the MCU take, because this is probably going to be, for me, the take of Moon Knight that I'd probably hold on to the most, because I don't read Moon Knight comics, you know? And that's where I feel they have to, I feel for Moon Knight fans, do justice to the character, because this will probably be the version of the character that a lot of people like myself will be holding on to.
That's fair.
With that being said, yeah, there's a lot of conflicting parts as far as things that I like and things I don't like. And I guess another one I could speak on is Khonshu, the character himself. Like, I really like him. Like, I like the character. And he's kind of like Venom in a sense. But I don't know if you guys can kind of see the parallels between the characters. And so it's fun to like that character. But the problem that I had with Khonshu, especially in the third episode, is since I'm not a Moon Knight fan, I don't know the impact of Khonshu being imprisoned by the gods, because I'm not familiar with Moon Knight, so I don't know what those stakes are supposed to mean.
I think Steven's going to lose his abilities. Sorry, Mark. Because Khonshu gave him his powers.
I will say, though, the comics are fairly different from how the show has been portraying Mark and Steven's abilities and the relationship with Khonshu. So even as someone who has read the comics, I am not sure what implications Khonshu's imprisonment would have. I would assume that means they can no longer summon the suit, but I can't say for sure, because there's clearly a difference between the comic version and the show version. So there's some things we can only speculate on, you know?
Well, I feel like they've given us a bone there, because Arrow, who's very familiar with being a servant of Khonshu, can't summon a suit without a direct relationship to him, or without being chosen by Khonshu as his avatar. He's kind of in a space where he's got to achieve the mission on his own, which is probably why Khonshu told, who was it, Steven, at the end, that he needed Mark to go and find Khonshu, kind of like he did before, I guess, on his deathbed, because Arrow can't summon a suit, so I'm assuming the guys can't either, and they're going to need to repeat whatever ritual rites ended up being what established a like symbiotic bond between Khonshu and Mark Spector's spirits. But I guess
Maybe.
that's just spectating.
I guess what I'm trying to say is its importance to me as an audience, like somebody's sacrifice. Like, this was Khonshu making a sacrifice, but I didn't feel the power of his sacrifice the way, like, let's say, certain heroes snapped away, you know? It was like, although I like the character, I didn't feel the connection yet to feel the weight of that sacrifice.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Maybe it was just a sacrifice they threw in to have fans empathize with him. Like, Khonshu so far seems just like an angsty teenager. He seems like an angsty teenager that's been a teenager for a long time, very powerful, very stunted in his growth, and he's got these good intentions, but he's got this poor approach to them.
Yeah.
And I feel like Stephen, who's opposed to these archaic and arbitrary demands of gods, is the only one that's super vocal about it. But Mark is an indentured servant, and he's just using Khonshu as a means to an end. But because of all these different relationships with this god, or all the different relationships with gods that people can have, i.e., Arrow, you can't really have a clean cut say at what Khonshu is, because he's so many things to so many different people. But I guess that's gods and religion, right?
Yeah, another thing is Khonshu was always very enigmatic from what I remember in the comics. Like, he didn't really speak to the guys that much. He was more just, he was a presence, that they had some reverence for, but didn't really communicate with, especially not directly. And when they did, it was, it was questionable whether it really happened. And Khonshu wasn't always seen in a good light, in the comics. He was sometimes. I don't want to keep bringing up the comics as if I'm holding the show to the standard, like it has to be like the comics, because I don't feel that way. But yeah, Khonshu is a tricky thing to portray, I think.
So you said you don't want to compare it to the comics. I haven't read the comics, but I would think there are certain interpretations that wouldn't you like to see from the comics? And shouldn't it kind of live to that standard? Like, I have this gripe with DC that there are so many Batman stories out there that they still haven't told that they can bring to live action that they haven't. And I want to see the representations of those stories. Is there any is there any of that you seek, or like, since you do come from the Moon Knight comics?
Adaptations shouldn't always have to be beholden to source material, because some things have to be changed in adaptation, and sometimes changes get made that are improvements even. So it's all about the creative freedom, I guess, of adaptations to make changes here and there. But as well as that, the Moon Knight comics are tricky to. What I don't really want to happen is for the show to come out, and then for the next several years, Moon Knight is only the version that was in the show. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Like,
Then that suddenly in all the comics, Moon Knight is exactly the same as the show, and no more. There's no more variety or experimentation. I think that would be a shame, but
I think there's some amount of that that's bound to happen because you're trying to bring new fans in. Like, there's this Riddler comic that was released after the Batman came out, and that's going to be a handful of adolescents or young adults or adults' first look at the Riddler. And that's a very different Riddler than we grew up with, because my first Riddler was Jim Carrey. And I'm not saying that's that's anything like what we've seen in canon with Hush or any of the other mentions that there have been across several different comic book runs, but depending on how well a movie is received, comic book writers and comic book storytellers and those part of that creative process do seem inclined to, before we see them in the movie. And I don't know how necessary that is, but I've also never read a Hawkman comic, so maybe it's not bad PR. And we're all, I think, a different breed of fans. I don't think we're toxic Marvel fans. I don't think, at least I'll speak for myself, that I'm super informed, that I know the content better than anyone else. I think I'm just a bit more familiar with it, or I engage it more. And maybe they want to reach all those different types of people, the new, the in between, and the very extreme. But we'll get there when we get there, I guess.
That's fair. Bringing in new fans is always understandable for these stories, and you want the characters to feel familiar. If a fan decides to go pick up a comic after seeing the Batman, for example,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you want the Riddler to feel familiar to what the reader knows. But
maybe you don't need there to be continuity. There's so many different personalities to Mark that you could say. I mean, Steven was supposed to be like what, billionaire playboy, and Jake Lockley was supposed to be taxi cab driver. I mean, you can stick to the source material in some ways, but if they do create a run that is canon to what's happening in the MCU, maybe that's not incredibly bad because there's so many different personalities to Mark that he could have years worth of different experiences. This could just be Mark after the Infinity Saga in the comics or after whatever's going on in present day, you know? And they could easily retcon it and still have it be canon later. DC does it all the time.
mhm.
Actually, Fox has done it a handful of times too. That's how we got Days of Future Past.
Oh yeah,
I don't know. I'm excited to see how they close out the show. I feel like I'm a bit more attached to even the villain Arrow. Like, I think he was a one-off in the comics, but the way they've used him in the show, I feel for the guy. I feel like he's still acting out of trauma, and all the contempt that he expressed for his manager's dissatisfaction was just because he felt unworthy, and he's still trying to achieve Khonshu's mission from his own point of view, just so that he can feel worthy, and that's sad. And I feel like there's a lot of good opportunities for storytelling, and I feel like this show has told a good mystery and story, and I'm interested in seeing how that plays out at the end.
I forgot about one funny part. I found it hilarious that the gods found any truth in what Arthur was saying because he walked in with the glass in his shoes, man. I wouldn't take anybody with glass in their shoes seriously. I'm like, you can hear him crunching in his walk as he's looking around, trying to look all innocent. You just hear him crunching.
Yeah, clearly, this man is also not well, and he's also killed people. So why are we just taking his his voice at face value?
Oh man.
Yeah, no, these gods are crazy, man. Like, they put one of their sisters to sleep, they turn the other one to stone, and there's a whole challenge of how to eradicate evil. It's just before or after, right? Kind of like Civil War in the comics. Uh, that point was made by one of our fans, Jasmine. Or what was it? Captain America 2? Where they had developed a program where they were trying to eliminate the threat before it became a threat. It seems in that way like it is something that we've seen before, but now they're doing it on a grander scale, and maybe that's so that they can tie it back into like Kang's plan and He Who's Been a Watcher, or the Watcher that we might come across in Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. And maybe they're just trying to leave us some breadcrumbs and prime us for there being a lot more of a presence of gods or multiversal threats or multiversal Avengers level threats in the coming movies and TV shows. And there's plenty more for us to talk about on that note soon. But yeah, it's crazy when you bring it back to television or a small scale story. Arrow's feet have to be in pain. Imagine that's where the episode ends. Like, that's the last thing we say before the outro music starts playing. That would be hilarious.
That is definitely, yeah, I would agree. that very first scene of him putting in the glass is pretty yikes.
Yeah, I knew I knew he was gonna be a character when when Jasmine and I put on episode 1 and saw that. I was like, all right, let's get into it. But any final thoughts, gentlemen?
Not for me. I'm just looking forward to the last 3 episodes, seeing where it takes us.
Yeah, me as well. I'm invested in Mark and Steven, and I believe the woman's name is Layla.
Mm-hmm.
I like the three of them. I'm a little more lukewarm on Khonshu and the Egyptian gods. I think it falls into the problem that a lot of these stories do, where I think that there's a lot of these stories where there are these all-powerful gods who've been ignoring, past events for a while.
Mm-hmm.
When the writers have to explain that away, it comes at the detriment of the gods because they end up looking either really immoral or really incompetent. Like
Agreed.
the gods, like you were saying, the Egyptian gods so far, they kind of don't seem that great. They sort of seem like they're either jerks or they're idiots, and we're not sure which.
Right? You want me to trust the voice of a god coming from a guy who looks like he works in accounting?
Yeah,
I don't know.
like,
No
yeah,
shade to anyone who works in the accounting field. I respect the work that you do.
yeah. But there is a certain vibe that some of the avatars of the gods gave off, where it's like you kind of feel like an agent from the Matrix. I don't know.
Oh, I can see that. I can
I
see
don't know
that.
if you're the most trustworthy guy.
Yeah. And maybe they'll come back to them later. Like a lot of people were, I guess, right after they saw episode 3, or maybe when they saw a trailer for it, they were thinking, I can't wait for Khonshu and Bass to connect. I believe Bass is the Egyptian. No, sorry, not Egyptian god.
No,
The.
Bast is Egyptian.
Hmm?
Bast is Egyptian.
Oh, Bass is Egyptian? Oh, then the Egyptian
Mhm.
god that we saw in Black Panther, the one that gave them their powers, I believe.
Oh well, yeah. I don't know if that. I don't believe that version is. That might be something else, or there may be some African cultures that worship Bast outside of Egypt. I don't actually know, but um, yeah, that would be interesting to see if they end up going that route, sort of tying it back to Black Panther.
Yeah, because then you could say this god left, also did its own thing, and here are more gods across all cultures that have been existing amongst humankind for centuries, and this is how they play into the cultures that they're a part of now.
Hmm.
There's a lot of potential, but it really comes down to how much of Moon Knight's story they're trying to tell versus what I currently call the Quantum Saga.
That's a good name.
Right? But yeah, let me go ahead and end the episode here. That's been Superhero Spectating with heroes Harold and Hassan and our special guest Tim. Feel free to come back for more episodes on Moon Knight and the rest of the Marvel Madness series, ending with Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness on May 6th. Excited to see you then.